Next, Representative John Curtis, who had been very, very comfortably winning in Congressional District 3, decides to roll the dice and leave that very safe spot and run for Senator Mitt Romney's seat. He joins us. He wins, and he joins us. Up next, he'll join us in studio, and we'll discuss why the big change.
So, Representative Curtis, I got to ask you. I'm looking at your position 6 months ago. You're a 3-time elected congressman. You're a shoo-in for a 4th position. You don't even have to show up, probably. You're on some prestigious committees. You're getting some props from the legislature in general, and you decide to jump in a Senate race, which at the time already had, I think Brad Wilson was jumped in. He was going to run against Mitt Romney before Mitt Romney wasn't running. He's in with both feet. He's got a ton of money, and you jump into that. You show up at the convention, and all of a sudden Trent Staggs has got Trump's endorsement, and you gave up a job for life. Really, I mean, is your wife like saying, "Hey, what are we doing here?" And here you are. I mean, you're like the bravest man I know.
Well, listen, if that's brave.
It is.
So, yeah, and I'll add to that list. I truly love the people in the 3rd Congressional District. They have become dear friends, and their issues have become my issues, and I've just really loved serving there. So to answer your question is nearly impossible if I try to do it logically.
Yeah.
I'll have to go to emotional because I don't think you can really justify it logically, that it just was something I knew I had to do. And, I don't know how many years I would have continued to serve in the House. I mean, yes, you could look at it and say, well, it's easy to get reelected there. But I think there's a burnout in the House that people don't really understand. I was there 5 years, and in 5 years, I was there total, but at 5-year point, I was halfway through the seniority in the House.
Yeah.
And you hear the stories about people staying a long time, but I think that every other year election cycle is harder on people than they realize.
Yeah, and we talked about that before we started here today, because it seems to me that in Congress, you're just always running. I mean, your election's over and you're starting with the next one. At least now you have a 6-year breather, although you're still going to be thinking about it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is if you go back to the founders, how they somehow perceived the importance of having one House on the every other year election cycle and one body on the 6-year cycle. And it creates a very different culture in those two bodies. And both those cultures, I think, are really important. I think the founders actually nailed it.
How so? What is it about the culture of turnover and constantly running do you think is a benefit to?
So as I understand it, the founders wanted the House to be closer to the people and more reactionary. And they wanted the Senate a little bit isolated. As you all know, the Senate originally was appointed by the state legislatures, not the people. And so it's not as if the Senate is not the people's as well, but I think what the founders were trying to create is a reactionary body that responded very quickly to the will of the people, and then balanced with a slower, more thoughtful, Senate. And what's funny is their age is kind of the stereotype, right? You see people almost in your mind walking slower in the Senate than in the House. And those are two very different cultures, and I've seen firsthand how they actually complement each other. If it were up to the House, we would pass legislation quickly, and it would have flaws, and we'd move through a lot of things quicker, but there'd be flaws. And if we're up to the Senate, we'd never pass anything.
Yeah.
Right? And so those two bodies, I think, actually balance each other out.
So you're leaving a body that, while it's close, and who knows where this cycle is going to end up, but tended to be, at least in your terms, more Republican, or at least now, to a body that leans slightly. And we don't even know where we're going to be in a year because both bodies are so close. But you're going to be razor thin on the Senate side,
Sure.
I would assume.
Yeah, I think on both sides you'll see a close margin. And, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think if I were a betting man, I'd say that Republicans will have the Senate but not the House.
You think it'll flip?
Listen, it's hard to justify asking the American people to send the Republicans back to leadership in the House based on what we've done with the leadership in the last year and a half. So we'll see, and that's if you look at the body as a whole. But these elections, as you know, are district by district, and so people may not see that district by district, and we may get a different result. Of course, I'm a Republican. I want us to have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, but we'll see.
And you've been one person who's been outspoken against the current administration. You haven't been shy about that. And who knows who your administration is going to be in January. Right now, it seems to be leaning slightly toward Trump, but you might very well have another 4 years with Biden.
So it's interesting. I'm old enough to remember the Jimmy Carter years and high inflation and problems overseas. There's just a lot of parallels to me. And I think that the country's in and I hear that as I go around the state and as a district, people are unhappy with where we're at. And they want us to get back on track economically, and inflation and these conflicts overseas. It's a bad place.
Yeah.
We're speaking with Representative John Skordas, who just won the primary for the Senate seat that Mitt Romney is leaving. I do want to talk about the convention and the primary, because the results are quite shocking. If we go back to convention, and there's two paths to get on the primary ballot. You can either gather signatures or come out of convention. Well, in convention, Trent Staggs had a resounding victory, wins with 70% of the vote. You had just 30. But when the primary happens, you win by 21 points. Yeah. What do you make of that?
I make that I have a lot of work to do with the delegates, and I listen, if there's delegates listening this morning, I want them to know I'm not giving up, right? Like, I've always worked hard to earn their vote. And, the results of the convention show I have a lot of work to do. And I take every group that I represent seriously, right? And listen, I'm not content unless I have 100%. And so, from my perspective, I feel like, okay, yeah, there's some issues with that. I get it. That's for somebody else to work through. For me, what I need to work through is how do I get their support next time around.
But you weren't going to take a chance at the convention, as did a lot of the people that we're talking to today. And you went through the signature gathering process to make sure that you were at least covered in that respect. And I think that there's an irony to that, in that I believe some of the delegates held that against people that went and got the signatures, and maybe not, but I don't know that your numbers would have been different had you just rolled the dice at the convention. I'm glad you didn't, but and you probably are too.
It's hard to know. I think if anybody watched my race 2 years ago, even the most ardent anti-signature gatherers would say, John, you need to go get signatures.
Yeah.
And what happens is it cuts both ways. If you don't get signatures, they see you as vulnerable and come after you for that. And that's unfortunate. I wish it were different. I wish they would say, oh, you didn't get signatures, we'll listen more carefully to you. That was not my experience. And 2 years ago, I didn't get signatures, and I walked away just within a whisper of not getting my 40%.
Yes.
And the signature gathering, is it 28,000 signatures you need to gather?
It's a huge bar. It's 28,000. And that, I think if people do open this up and take a look at it, one of the things they need to look at is how out of reach that is for the average candidate. And I don't think that's healthy, right? I think we have to have something that the average candidate can achieve. And 28,000 signatures is overwhelming.
It is, because to me, you think with a state with 3 million population, it shouldn't be that hard. But what I saw was that people that went through the signature gathering process paid pretty dearly for that. And Celeste Malloy, who we're going to interview today, didn't want to expend that, and she got through convention on a razor thin. I think she had 43%.
Which is, here again, very similar to my experience 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so when Celeste, and I talk, I'm going to say, Celeste, get signatures next time.
Right.
If you don't mind sticking around, we're speaking with Representative John Skordas, wins the primary for the Senate seat that is up this November. But I do want to talk about the legacy that you're leaving in the House with the Conservative Climate Caucus and what you look to carry over into the Senate. John Skordas wins his race with 51% of the vote. Trent Staggs garners 30%. So a 21-point victory. Congratulations. That's a big win.
At the Skordas home, we call that winner, chicken dinner.
That is a winner.
My wife literally posts that up on the refrigerator. If you win a card game or anything at the Skordas home, you get winner, chicken dinner.
1 point, 21 points. Does it matter?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
A win's a win. Okay, there's a few things I would like to discuss with you. Yeah. Number one, as you're moving from Congressional District 3 and now you're moving into the Senate, how do the issues change for you, or what do you focus on when you're representing the entire state versus Congressional District 3?
Well, the good news for me is some of the issues I've worked the most on and spent the most time on apply all across the state. I'll point to public lands and energy, and so I'm really excited to carry that onto the Senate side. It's interesting because I believe Mike Lee will likely chair, they call it E&R over on the Senate side, which has been my lane on the House, and so he and I even had a brief conversation last night about committee assignments. And what we'll try to do is make sure that we're not overlapping and leaving holes for the state with committee assignments. So I have to kind of digest that to say, okay, well, just because I did that in the House doesn't mean I'm exactly going to duplicate it over in the Senate. And then I also think, I love to kind of grow where I'm planted, and I didn't start out to be a public lands expert, but that's kind of where life took me, if that makes sense. And so I'm also excited to see what opportunities are there for me in the Senate that might be new.
So you have a good working relationship with Senator Lee.
A lot of people ask me that. They're concerned about that because they know that's important for the state. And
because let's face it, Romney and Lee didn't always see eye to eye.
Yeah. I think what I would point to is Senator Lee and I have had a chance to work together for 7 years, with me in the House and him in the Senate. We like each other. There's respect. The staffs know and like each other. And we've been able to work quite successfully with Senator Lee on a number of bills. And I'm optimistic. He and I spoke briefly last night. He was kind enough to come over to my event, and we were both very optimistic about the relationship. And I think we both acknowledge that, hey, we're different, right? And we see things differently, but it's incredibly important for the state that we work with the synergy concept and complement each other. And I think you're going to see that from both of us, a real desire to work for the state, and that we actually agree on quite a few issues.
And you mentioned committee assignments, and I know that it's not your say being a freshman, but are there some things that you would like to do that are intriguing to you in the Senate?
So I mentioned the public lands issue and energy, and if that lane's, we'll work there no matter kind of where we end up on committee. But if you look at the holes for the state, by holes meaning where are we not covered? Chris Stewart was on Armed Force Services in the House, and right now nobody is on Armed Force Services in the House or the Senate. That's what I would call a big hole for the state. Very, very important. So obviously we'll be looking there. Banking and finance is also a huge deal here in the state, and there's a hole there. And currently, usually we've had somebody there. We don't have anybody there. Those are two, we call them A committees over in the Senate that I'm going to look really close at, and I think it would be helpful for the state if I can land on those committees.
One of the accomplishments in your time in the House, obviously, was the Conservative Climate Caucus, something that you really had started up. Can you give us a little bit of the history of why you decided to take that on, and then how do you carry that over into the Senate?
Well, first of all, let's enjoy the moment that every political expert in the world would have said, "Don't talk climate," right? You're
as a Republican,
yeah.
Right. Well, and 7 years ago as well. I mean, it's a much different conversation now than it was when you first started.
Right. But I could see what I would call the gap, and the gap was a place for Republicans to land that felt comfortable to them. And it felt like 7 years ago that if you were going to talk climate, your only option was the Green New Deal. And that just was a non-starter for Republicans. They couldn't go there. And as I studied it and spent a lot of time on it, I found this, what I would call a smorgasbord of conservative approaches to energy, that even if you didn't start off to reduce emissions, you did reduce emissions. And so, for instance, nuclear, geothermal, even our fossil fuels can be used to reduce emissions. And that's one of the things I think that's why I received a high percentage of my vote from areas that are coal, oil, and gas is I'm the first one that has actually said to them, you can be part of the solution. Everybody else has said you're the problem. And this approach that they can actually be part of the solution, you don't have to demonize them. This approach that there's nuclear, there's geothermal, and this whole host of things that reduce emissions, gave Republicans a place to land on this. And one of the things I love to ask people is, do you want to leave the earth better than you found it? Of course, I've never had anybody, right, say that. Is less pollution better than more pollution? Great. Those are my litmus tests, not these other litmus tests that we use. And so we have been very successful in making it more comfortable for Republicans to talk about this. And then I also point out that by not talking about it, we've left a void which is filled by policy that we don't think is necessarily beneficial. And I'd point to Europe, right? If you're not careful, Europe went down a path that wasn't helpful for them, and actually now they're putting out more emissions. And so we created this place to land. We call it the Conservative Climate Caucus. Shockingly, It's now one of the largest caucuses in Washington. Almost half of all House Republicans are part of the Conservative Climate Caucus. And I'm just telling you, there's moments where you feel like what we are called payback moments, like, well, wow, maybe we really did something. In the third congressional debate, when Thomas Wright asked the candidates if they would join the Conservative Climate Caucus, 5 out of 5 said yes.
Yeah.
To me, that was like, oh, yes.
Can you imagine that
right.
a decade ago or even a couple of decades ago?
Yeah. And I believe Senator Kennedy has won that race, and he and I have had great conversations, and I think he'll pick up right where I left off in supporting this place for Republicans to land in a very conservative way that doesn't force them to give up their conservative credentials, but also shows and validates that we do care about the earth.
Representative Curtis, at the last segment, we talked about your being able to work with the current administration if that's the way it goes. Talk to us about what kind of working relationship you think you would have if the Republicans take the presidency.
So this is where I smile and say I'm the only.
Oh, you were smiling before I finished the question.
Well, because I'm the only candidate in my race that actually has done that before. So you can always speculate like how you'll work with President Trump, but until you actually do it, I don't think you know. And listen, it took me a while to land on where I was, but it's very clear to me that there's never been a president I'm all in 100% with.
Sure.
Ronald Reagan's my favorite, right? And there would have been differences. So I think it's a false narrative to say, I'm always going to be 100% with any president. And the reality of it is, any president, and let's just say President Trump, when he's promoting things that are in line with Utah values, I want to be wind at his back. I'd point to tax reform, deregulation, just a number of Abraham Accords, right? A number of things that I would say they were right in line with Utah's values. But I also was not afraid to speak up when we disagreed.
Right.
And I could, and one of the things too that I'd say to our people who love President Trump a lot is like he spent too much money,
Right.
And so I didn't vote for his budgets, and I think that's what you would have had me do. And I use that to just point out and say, look, when he's in harmony with Utah's values, I'm there. When he's not, I'll oppose him.
I appreciate not spending money, regardless of who's in the White House,
Right.
because, boy,
That's a big deal. Yeah.
we have a spending problem, and you saw it firsthand in the House. Representative John Curtis, congratulations on your
Thanks.
victory.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks,
so
both.
much for
Good to be
joining
with
us.
both of you this morning.
I know you only have a couple hours left, and then you're back on to a plane.
Back to Washington.
Back to Washington.
Yeah.
Back to work. You still got a job to do.
I have a job.
And a
I love my
campaign to
job.
run.
Yeah.
Here it is. Representative John Curtis. Up next.